Inside California's Pelican Bay Supermax, a true crime prison exposé. The sound of violence. The lights flickered inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit, known as the SHU. It was late at night, and the prison was supposed to be silent. But silence doesn't last long in a place built for California's most dangerous men. Suddenly, a scream echoed down the corridor. Guards rushed in only to find an inmate sprawled on the concrete floor of his cell, blood pooling beneath him. His attacker had carved a weapon out of nothing more than plastic and metal scraps. The guards shouted orders, alarms blared, and the air filled with chaos. This was not just another prison fight. This was Pelican Bay Supermax, the place designed to end prison violence, but instead, it had become the perfect breeding ground for it. How could a prison built to control the worst criminals in California turn into a place where crime never stopped? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. The birth of Pelican Bay. In the late 1980s, California faced a crisis. Gangs ran rampant inside prisons, controlling drugs, money, and even murders from behind bars. Violence spilled over so badly that the state needed a new solution. That solution was Pelican Bay State Prison, opened in 1989 near Crescent City, California. The location was no accident. It was remote, surrounded by forests and fog, far from big cities. Lawmakers believed the isolation itself would break down even the strongest gang networks. Inside, the prison looked like something out of a war zone. Concrete walls stretched high with razor wire on top. Guard towers pointed rifles down at the yard. And deep within the facility sat the SHU, the security housing unit. Here, inmates were locked down for 22 to 23 hours a day in windowless concrete cells. They ate alone, exercised alone, and lived with almost no human contact. The state promised that this extreme isolation would crush prison gangs. But instead, the gangs adapted. They began communicating through coded letters, tapping messages through pipes, and even yelling through vents. The prison had been built to silence them, but it only sharpened their methods. And before long, the silence of Pelican Bay was broken, by blood. The first major riot. It didn't take long for Pelican Bay to become infamous. In the early years, violence erupted in the yard during what was supposed to be a routine outdoor exercise. Rival gangs, the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood, clashed in a sudden explosion of fists, blades, and homemade weapons. Guards fired warning shots, then live rounds, but the chaos didn't stop. Inmates were dragged away bleeding, some never to recover. The prison that was built to control gangs had now become the stage for one of the bloodiest prison riots in California's history. The aftermath was brutal. Prison officials locked down the facility even tighter. More men were shoved into solitary. But inside the cells, the gangs were already planning their next moves. They saw Pelican Bay not as a cage but as their headquarters. And while the outside world thought these men had been cut off, the truth was far darker. Orders for killings were still leaving Pelican Bay, and those orders would reach far beyond the prison walls. The power of the SHU. To outsiders, solitary confinement sounds like punishment. But to the leaders of California's prison gangs, the SHU was a throne room. From their cells, men like the generals of Nuestra Familia and the Aryan Brotherhood sent coded instructions to soldiers in other prisons, and even on the streets of Los Angeles, San Diego, and Oakland. Entire drug operations were managed from inside Pelican Bay. One inmate managed to smuggle out letters hidden in legal paperwork. Another used his own visitors to relay secret hand signals. Even though they were locked in tiny cells with no windows, they had influence stretching across the state. Prison officials realized something terrifying. Pelican Bay wasn't stopping crime. It was helping it evolve. And then came the case that made headlines across America. The torture of an inmate inside the very place that was supposed to be unbreakable. The torture scandal. In the 1990s, shocking reports surfaced about brutality not just between inmates, but from guards themselves. A lawsuit revealed disturbing stories of excessive force inside Pelican Bay. Inmates claimed they were beaten during searches, dragged through hallways, and left injured without medical care. One account described prisoners being shot with rubber bullets at close range. Another told of dogs being used during raids. The scandal rocked the prison system. Federal courts stepped in, demanding reforms. For the first time, Pelican Bay's walls could not hide what was happening inside. The world began asking, if this prison was built to end chaos, why was it creating even more? And while investigators cracked down on abuse, something far more sinister was boiling inside the SHU. Something that would erupt in a way nobody could control. The hunger strikes. By the early 2000s, the inmates had found a new weapon. Not shanks, not riots, but starvation. Thousands of men across California prisons, led by inmates inside Pelican Bay, began massive hunger strikes. Their demand was clear: an end to long-term solitary confinement. Some had been locked in the SHU for decades, never seeing the sun, never touching another human being. The strikes shook the system. Politicians, journalists, and human rights groups descended on Pelican Bay, calling it a violation of basic human rights. The prison was no longer just a correctional facility, it had become a symbol of punishment gone too far. As inmates grew weaker, some collapsing in their cells, the world was forced to watch. Would the state give in, or would it let the men die inside those gray walls? And just when the hunger strike seemed like it would break Pelican Bay, something darker was already waiting in the shadows. A prison within a prison. Life inside Pelican Bay was already harsh, but for many, the SHU became something worse than punishment. It was a prison within a prison. Inmates were trapped in 8 by 10-foot concrete boxes. The doors were solid steel with only a slot for food trays. The only time they left was for a 1-hour exercise session, alone, in what looked more like a dog kennel than a yard. Prisoners described losing track of time. Without windows or clocks, days and nights blended into one endless stretch of gray silence. Some men began talking to themselves. Others scratched messages into the walls just to remind themselves they were still alive. But the isolation didn't break everyone. For the leaders of California's gangs, it became an opportunity. By stripping away normal prison life, Pelican Bay accidentally gave them complete control over their followers. Every word they whispered, every note they smuggled out, carried more weight than ever before. The prison thought it had buried these men alive. Instead, it had made their voices louder. And then came an order that would send shockwaves across the entire state. A contract killing that started in Pelican Bay but ended hundreds of miles away. Orders from the inside. Investigators discovered something chilling. Even while locked in total isolation, Pelican Bay gang leaders were orchestrating murders on the outside. Using coded letters called kites and hidden signals passed through attorneys or family visits, these men directed soldiers on the streets. One shocking case involved a hit ordered by a high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood. The target was a witness set to testify against the gang. Even though the leader hadn't seen freedom in years, his message slipped out of the SHU. Weeks later, the witness was found dead. The news stunned Californians. If Pelican Bay couldn't stop murder plots, what good was it? To the public, it seemed like the prison wasn't locking crime away, it was giving it a command center. Prison officials scrambled, tightening mail rules and restricting visits. But it was already too late. The gangs had proven they could reach beyond the walls. And in retaliation for the crackdown, the violence inside the prison was about to explode. The yard turns red. It was supposed to be another controlled day in the prison yard. Inmates were released in small groups, each watched by armed guards. But everyone in Pelican Bay knew the tension had been building for weeks. Rival gangs, Latino and black groups, were staring each other down, waiting for the first move. And then it happened. A fight broke out in the corner of the yard, quickly spreading like fire. Homemade blades flashed in the sunlight. Men charged across the yard, stabbing, punching, and stomping their enemies. Guards fired warning shots from the towers, but the violence raged on. The ground was stained red. Sirens screamed across the prison as officers stormed in with tear gas and rubber bullets. Dozens of inmates were dragged away bleeding, some barely clinging to life. The riot sent a message loud and clear. Pelican Bay was no longer in control. The gangs were. And if the state didn't find a way to stop it, the next wave of violence could be even worse. Breaking point. By the late 2000s, Pelican Bay was reaching a breaking point. Reports described men who had been in solitary confinement for over 20 years. Some had lost their sanity. Others had taken their own lives. Families of inmates began to speak out, describing how their loved ones had turned into shells of who they once were. Lawyers and activists called it psychological torture. The pressure on California's prison system grew heavier every day. Lawmakers were forced to answer. Was Pelican Bay protecting the public, or destroying the people inside it? But while the debate raged in courtrooms and newspapers, something else was happening inside those gray walls. Inmates who had once sworn loyalty to their gangs began to crack. Some turned informants, feeding information to investigators in exchange for a chance at freedom from the SHU. These dropouts became valuable weapons for the state, but also walking targets inside the prison. And soon, one of those informants would pay the price in the most brutal way possible. The silent hit. It happened quietly, deep inside the SHU corridors. An inmate who had once been a loyal soldier to his gang had turned on them. He gave information to investigators, naming names, exposing codes, and helping authorities connect murders across California. But inside Pelican Bay, betrayal never goes unpunished. Somehow, despite cameras, guards, and locked steel doors, a weapon made from sharpened metal reached his cell. When guards made their rounds, they found him lifeless, his body marked by violence that should have been impossible under maximum security. The message was clear. Even in the most controlled prison in America, no one was untouchable. Pelican Bay was built to stop crime. Instead, it had become a place where crime evolved, where silence hid violence, and where fear ruled every corner. And while the state tried to cover up the blood, a storm of controversy was about to blow the doors wide open. The outside world looks in. As the years passed, Pelican Bay was no longer just a prison. It had become a symbol. News outlets called it America's Alcatraz of the West. Human rights groups compared its conditions to torture chambers. Journalists began digging deeper, uncovering shocking stories of men who hadn't touched another human in decades. Some hadn't seen natural sunlight in over 20 years. Families told stories of phone calls where their loved ones sounded broken, their voices trembling with paranoia and despair. But the state defended the prison. Officials insisted Pelican Bay was necessary, that without it, gangs would run California's streets unchecked. To them, this was the only way to keep order. Still, cracks in that defense were starting to show. Investigations revealed medical neglect, rising suicide attempts, and even wrongful imprisonment of men in the SHU who had no gang ties at all. The spotlight was brighter than ever. And the next event would bring Pelican Bay from a hidden fortress into a global headline. The 2011 hunger strike. In July 2011, something unprecedented happened. More than 6,000 inmates across California launched a hunger strike, many of them from Pelican Bay. For the first time in history, rival gangs inside the SHU united, not for war but for survival. They refused meals, demanding an end to indefinite solitary confinement. Some went weeks without food, their bodies wasting away. Guards tried to pressure them, offering extra rations or moving them into different cells, but the strike didn't stop. Outside the walls, supporters gathered in protest. Families held signs, activists marched, and news reporters swarmed Crescent City. Suddenly, Pelican Bay was at the center of a human rights storm. California's leaders couldn't ignore it any longer. Lawmakers promised hearings and courts began reviewing cases. But inside the SHU, men were collapsing, their ribs showing through their skin. Doctors warned that deaths could come at any moment. And just when it seemed like the system might bend, violence once again tore through the silence. Violence erupts again. The pressure cooker inside Pelican Bay was reaching critical mass. Guards feared that as the hunger strike dragged on, tensions between groups would explode. And their fears proved right. One afternoon, during a routine movement of inmates from cells to showers, chaos erupted. An inmate lunged at another with a hidden blade, slashing his neck before guards could intervene. Alarms blared, doors slammed shut, and chaos rippled through the tier. The hunger strike had shown unity. But unity in Pelican Bay was fragile. Old rivalries still burned hot beneath the surface. Now, with the prison stretched thin, every spark threatened to ignite an inferno. The administration doubled down, locking down even tighter, canceling visits, cutting off privileges. But the more they squeezed, the more dangerous Pelican Bay became. And behind the scenes, lawyers were preparing a case that would shake the very foundation of California's prison system. The courts step in. By 2012, lawsuits against Pelican Bay reached federal court. Lawyers argued that indefinite solitary confinement violated the Constitution, calling it cruel and unusual punishment. They presented testimony from psychologists, families, and former inmates who described how years in the SHU had destroyed minds and bodies. The courtroom heard about men hallucinating voices in the silence, banging their heads against walls, and even carving into their own skin just to feel something. Experts explained how isolation caused permanent brain damage. California fought back, insisting the SHU was necessary to control gangs. But under mounting pressure, judges ordered reviews, demanding changes in how inmates were placed in solitary. For the first time in decades, Pelican Bay faced the possibility of real reform. But while the courts debated, the prison itself was already boiling toward another eruption, this one more violent than ever before. The Deadly Showdown. It began in the yard on a gray morning. Fog hung over the razor wire as inmates were released in small groups. At first, everything seemed calm. But suddenly, two rival gang members locked eyes. Words were exchanged, then fists, then knives. Within seconds, the entire yard exploded into a riot. Inmates sprinted across the dirt, stabbing and beating anyone in their way. Guards fired warning shots, then tear gas, then live rounds. When the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with bodies. Dozens were injured, some critically. Blood soaked the gravel where men had fought for dominance in a prison already drowning in violence. The riot was one of the deadliest in Pelican Bay's history. And it proved one thing. No matter how much steel, concrete, or isolation the state built, they could not cage the violence inside. Life on the edge. Inside Pelican Bay, every day was a test of survival. Even in solitary, prisoners found ways to fight back against the crushing silence. Some turned to exercise, doing push-ups and squats in their tiny cells to keep from losing their minds. Others memorized entire books or wrote letters that would take weeks to be delivered. But for many, the mental pressure was too much. Men reported hearing phantom voices, seeing shadows in their cells, or feeling like they were being watched even when alone. Guards described inmates pacing in circles for hours, muttering to themselves or refusing food for days at a time. The prison was supposed to break gangs. Instead, it was breaking people. And when someone finally snapped, the results were terrifying. One night, guards making rounds found a cell door smeared with blood. Inside, an inmate had torn his body apart in desperation. He was alive, but barely. The SHU had claimed another mind. The guards' burden. It wasn't only inmates who suffered inside Pelican Bay. Guards, too, paid the price for working in such a brutal place. Day after day, they walked the echoing corridors, staring into the eyes of men who hated them. Some officers admitted feeling constantly on edge, never knowing when an inmate might strike. Others spoke about the toll on their families, bringing stress, nightmares, and paranoia home with them. Many turned to alcohol, unable to shake off what they saw. The prison's atmosphere of tension didn't just belong to inmates. It swallowed everyone who stepped inside. Guards were ordered to keep the peace, but at Pelican Bay, peace never lasted. And soon, one of their own would become a target in a way nobody expected. During a routine search, a guard entered a cell, only to be ambushed by a hidden blade. The attack was fast, brutal, and left the officer bleeding on the floor as alarms blared across the block. Smuggling the shadows. How did weapons keep appearing inside one of the most secure prisons in America? Investigators soon found the answer: smuggling. Despite cameras, searches, and strict rules, contraband poured into Pelican Bay. Corrupt staff, visitors, and even inmates working in kitchens or laundry found ways to sneak in drugs, phones, and sharp metal pieces. Cell phones, hidden in legal books or food packages, became one of the deadliest tools. With them, inmates could order hits, run drug trades, and communicate with the outside world instantly. In one shocking case, a gang leader in the SHU was caught orchestrating an entire meth ring across California, using nothing but a smuggled phone. The discovery triggered another sweep, with guards raiding cells and confiscating dozens of devices. But every time they cracked down, new contraband slipped in. And when a phone call ordered a murder inside another California prison, it proved the gangs were not just surviving, they were thriving. The longest isolation. By now, some men had been in Pelican Bay's SHU for more than 25 years. They hadn't touched another human being in decades. Their families grew old without them. Their children became adults while they stayed in cages. Psychologists warned that this kind of isolation was beyond punishment, it was permanent damage. But for the prison gangs, long isolation became a badge of honor. Leaders bragged about their time in the SHU, using it as proof of loyalty and power. One inmate, nicknamed the Ghost, had lived in solitary since the 1980s. Nobody had seen his face outside of that cell in decades. Guards whispered about him as if he were more legend than man. But legends can't last forever. In 2015, California was finally forced to confront what Pelican Bay had become. After years of lawsuits and protests, a federal court ruling declared long-term solitary confinement unconstitutional. The order was clear. Men who had spent decades in the SHU had to be released back into general population. And with that decision, the prison was about to face its most dangerous chapter yet. Return to the yard. For the first time in decades, hundreds of men walked out of their solitary cells and into the general prison yard. To them, it felt like stepping into another world. The sun was blinding, the voices overwhelming, the human contact almost unbearable. But for the gangs, it was an opportunity. Leaders who had been locked away were suddenly back among their soldiers. Old rivalries reignited instantly. Guards watched nervously as powerful men returned to the very environment they had once controlled with blood. At first, it seemed like peace might hold. Inmates kept their distance, testing boundaries. But soon the inevitable happened. One afternoon, as two groups crossed paths in the yard, a fight broke out. Blades flashed, fists flew, and guards opened fire with rifles from the towers. Bodies dropped, sirens screamed, and Pelican Bay descended into chaos once again. The prison had tried isolation. Now it was facing integration. And both paths led to violence. The world watches. After decades of secrecy, Pelican Bay was no longer hidden from the world. Documentaries, news crews, and human rights investigators were exposing its darkest corners. Families of inmates staged protests on the steps of courthouses, holding up photos of men locked away for half their lives. The public was split. Some saw Pelican Bay as necessary, a cage for the worst of the worst. Others saw it as proof that America's justice system had gone too far. But while the outside world debated, inside those walls, inmates prepared for something bigger. They felt the spotlight and they were determined to use it. And when lawyers finally entered the SHU to collect testimony, guards discovered graffiti on the walls, coded messages scratched into concrete. Warnings, threats, and plans. The gangs weren't finished. They were waiting. The informant's fate. The battle for control wasn't just between guards and gangs, it was also inside the gangs themselves. Some members couldn't take the pressure anymore. They turned into informants, trading secrets for lighter sentences or a chance at life outside solitary. But being a snitch in Pelican Bay was a death sentence. In one chilling case, an inmate who had turned informant was cornered during a transfer. Within seconds he was stabbed repeatedly, collapsing in front of officers before they could react. The attack sent a clear message: betrayal would not be forgiven. Even with cameras, guards, and riot teams, the gangs still enforced their own rules with blood. And now, prison officials faced a new nightmare: how to protect the very people giving them information. The escape attempt. Despite being one of the most secure prisons in the world, Pelican Bay wasn't immune to desperate attempts at freedom. One night, guards discovered a tunnel being dug beneath a workshop floor. It wasn't long, but it was enough to prove the impossible. Even here, men still dreamed of escape. The inmates behind the plot had smuggled tools, hidden dirt in laundry bags, and worked silently for weeks. When officers uncovered it, they were stunned. If the plan had continued, the tunnel could have led to the outer fence. The prison cracked down immediately: lockdowns, strip searches, cell sweeps. But the discovery rattled everyone. If men could try to break out of Pelican Bay, what else were they capable of? Fire in the yard. The yard, already a powder keg, finally erupted in flames, literally. During a fight between rival groups, someone ignited a homemade firebomb, setting the gravel ablaze. Smoke rose over the prison walls as inmates fought in the chaos. Guards stormed the yard with tear gas, pepper spray, and batons. The flames spread quickly, forcing officers to drag prisoners out while trying to put out the fire. By the time it was over, several men were burned, dozens were injured, and the yard looked like a battlefield. The message was clear. No matter how much concrete or control Pelican Bay tried to impose, violence always found a way to erupt. Shadows of the future. By the mid-2010s, Pelican Bay was changing. The courts had ruled against indefinite solitary. Hundreds of men were transferred out of the SHU. Some saw this as victory, proof that reform was possible. But others warned that releasing hardened gang leaders back into general population was a recipe for disaster. Violence surged not just at Pelican Bay but across California prisons. Old rivalries were reignited. New alliances were formed. The SHU, once feared as a dungeon, now stood half-empty. But its shadow lingered. Every man who left carried scars, mental, physical, and emotional. And just when officials thought the worst was behind them, a new wave of unrest spread across California's prisons, with Pelican Bay once again at the heart of it. The empty cells. When the federal courts forced California to reduce the use of solitary, hundreds of cells in Pelican Bay's SHU stood empty for the first time in decades. The eerie silence of those concrete blocks became a ghostly reminder of what the prison once represented. Guards who had spent their careers patrolling the SHU walked the abandoned tiers, listening to their own footsteps echo off the walls. Inmates who once lived there described the place as both hell and home, a tomb where they had lost pieces of their sanity. But while the SHU seemed finished, its legacy lived on. Many of the men released back into general population carried the scars of years in isolation. They were unpredictable, hardened, and in many cases more dangerous than before. And soon, those scars would cut open in the form of fresh violence. The cycle of violence. The hope that reforms would calm the prison system quickly faded. Inmates freed from the SHU returned to old roles as gang leaders, reconnecting with their networks. Riots once again spread across yards, not just at Pelican Bay but at prisons statewide. In one clash, dozens of inmates armed with sharpened steel rods turned the yard into a war zone. Guards unleashed tear gas and fired live rounds from the towers, but by the time it was over, blood stained the gravel and bodies lay unmoving. Officials admitted what many had feared: ending solitary hadn't ended violence. In fact, it had unleashed it. Pelican Bay had traded silence for chaos. And the chaos wasn't slowing down. The cost of control. Running Pelican Bay came at a massive cost. The state poured millions into keeping the Supermax running: staff salaries, medical care, riot gear, endless repairs after fights and fires. But what California couldn't buy was peace. Every year, lawsuits, investigations, and reforms drained resources, while the violence inside the prison kept demanding more. Guards were injured, inmates were killed, and families on both sides were left broken. For the community of Crescent City, Pelican Bay was both a lifeline and a burden. The prison gave jobs, but it also brought fear. Locals whispered about escapes, about guards being targeted outside the walls, about living in the shadow of California's darkest cage. And then, one event shook Crescent City itself: a gang war that spilled out of Pelican Bay and onto the streets. When the walls fail. It started with coded orders smuggled out of the prison. Rival gangs, fueled by leaders inside Pelican Bay, launched attacks on each other in Los Angeles and Oakland. Drive-by shootings, drug-related killings, and coordinated assaults spread across California. Investigators traced the violence back to Crescent City. Somehow, leaders locked inside concrete cells had ignited a storm on the outside. For the families of guards living near Pelican Bay, it was a nightmare. They realized the prison wasn't just containing violence, it was radiating it outward. Even locked away, the men inside had the power to spark chaos on the streets. The line between inside and outside was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. And then came a shocking incident that proved Pelican Bay could never truly be contained. The deadly reminder. One morning, guards discovered an inmate in the SHU dead in his cell. At first it looked like suicide. But the evidence suggested something else: an orchestrated hit carried out under impossible conditions. No weapon was found. No one had entered the cell. Yet the man had wounds that couldn't be explained. Rumors spread fast. Had the gangs found a way to kill even inside solitary? The incident sent shockwaves through the prison system. If an inmate could die under maximum security without explanation, then Pelican Bay was not just a prison, it was a mystery, a place where violence defied even logic. And as investigators scrambled for answers, another riot brewed just beyond the steel doors. The pandemic behind bars. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, Pelican Bay became a hotbed of fear. Cells built for isolation suddenly became breeding grounds for disease. Guards and inmates alike tested positive, and quarantines locked entire blocks down for weeks. Families on the outside begged for information, but communication was scarce. Inmates described being trapped in cells with sick cellmates, unable to protect themselves. Guards worried about bringing the virus home. The pandemic exposed what had always been true: prisons weren't sealed fortresses. They were fragile systems, and when something slipped in, it spread like fire. And as illness swept through Pelican Bay, violence once again followed. Blood in the quarantine. During the height of lockdown, tensions between inmates boiled over. With movement restricted and tempers at a breaking point, two rival prisoners managed to clash in a supposed safe quarantine zone. The fight escalated fast: fists, then shanks, then chaos. Guards stormed in wearing protective gear, dragging bloodied inmates apart. For many officers, the scene was haunting. A deadly mix of pandemic fear and the same old Pelican Bay violence. The message was clear: no virus, no lockdown, no court order could stop the cycle. The violence wasn't an accident, it was built into the DNA of the prison itself. The legacy of the SHU. Even with the SHU mostly emptied after federal reforms, its shadow loomed large. Men who had spent decades in isolation carried trauma that would never heal. Some were released back into society, unable to adjust after years in darkness. Psychologists described it as a living death. Former prisoners spoke of panic attacks in crowded spaces, paranoia in everyday life, and voices they still heard in their heads. Pelican Bay had been built to break gangs, but in the process, it had broken countless minds. Its reputation spread worldwide as an example of America's harshest punishments. And then came the question that still divides California. Did Pelican Bay make the state safer, or did it simply build monsters behind walls? Reform or ruin? In recent years, lawmakers and activists have pushed for change. Some argue Pelican Bay should be shut down entirely. Others demand more oversight, more rehabilitation, more chances for inmates to rebuild their lives. But opponents fire back. Without Pelican Bay, where do you put the worst of the worst? California still battles violent gangs, and many believe that without Supermax prisons, chaos would spill everywhere. Inside, guards remain wary, knowing one wrong move can unleash another riot. Outside, families of victims argue that men inside Pelican Bay made their choices and deserve every ounce of punishment. The debate rages on. And through it all, Pelican Bay stands, concrete walls rising above the fog, a symbol of fear and failure, safety and cruelty. The prison that never sleeps. Today, Pelican Bay remains one of California's most infamous prisons. Its walls hold the stories of riots, hunger strikes, lawsuits, escapes, and deaths that shook the nation. To some, it's the last line of defense against chaos. To others, it's proof that America's justice system went too far. Either way, Pelican Bay is more than a prison, it's a warning. Every scream in the SHU, every riot in the yard, every life broken by isolation has left a scar that can't be erased. The gangs are still there. The violence is still there. The fear is still there. And as long as Pelican Bay's gates remain locked, one truth will always echo through its halls. This is the place where silence hides screams, where punishment breeds power, and where California's darkest secrets remain sealed behind concrete and steel.